so happy to give this talk. I was just going to share the note that I really haven't done much research since being retired. The most I thought I could do is reflect on some of my past work, which includes TOD, and cast it in terms of a host of challenges we currently face in the transportation field, all the upheavals we're in the midst of. So I have titled this TOD and Disruptors, and I think we're all aware of these kind of global megatrends and external forces, shocks to the systems that I think it's understood if we are going to sort of break out of this historical path dependence we've had in the transport sector on private mobility and internal combustion engines as a dominant form of propulsions. It is going to take this kind of dramatic Kuhnian shift because indeed the transport system, it's so hard to make significant change because of this lock-in or path dependence. You know, electric vehicles have a hard time penetrating the mobility marketplace, not only because you have these powerful oil conglomerates, but we have a massive distribution system of pipelines and fuel stations that it's really hard for any alternative form of mobility to challenge the internal combustion engine. And Thomas Kuhn sort of long quoted this idea, we only get significant change when there are these shocks to the system. And I think it's understood that collectively, these are a set of forces we're in the midst of that could bring about significant change. As it relates to disruptors, again, we're all aware of these, you know, some of our technological, some are sort of lifestyle shifts and megatrends. If you sort of break it down, some are working in favor of infill, compact city, and accordingly less travel in the sense of potentially less vehicle miles traveled per capita. And included here, we would have things like e-commerce. We're substituting physical trips to shopping with parcel panel trucks delivering things via Amazon or whatever to our front doorsteps, or shared mobility. If we're sharing vehicles, and if we ever get to the stage of robo-taxis, we could obviously reduce parking and have a lot more of our land given over to infill development instead of surface parking spaces. You know, we're aware of cities like Phoenix or Houston where it's claimed 30–35% of land area is just for surface parking. So all of those could work in favor of a compact, more potentially less car dependent urban landscape. But there's also a set of forces we're in the midst of that are working for decentralization and more travel in the form of more vehicle miles traveled per capita. And included here, I certainly would be automated autonomous vehicles. You know, all of these are basically ratcheting up the efficiency of private mobility, and accordingly, we would expect the structured response to be a deconcentration of urban growth. But I would even include electric vehicles. You know, what electric vehicles in certain ways do is move carbon, remove it from the table of the reasons why we want to promote sustainable mobility, be it public transit or cycling or whatever. It becomes less essential. But probably the factor that we're all most aware of is the effect of COVID and what it means in terms of people's lifestyle choices, employment, where people work, how they get to work. So, you know, there hasn't been a lot of modeling of the collective effects of these factors. A lot of studies have suggested autonomous vehicles in the next 15 to 20 years, depending if we ever hit level 5 on a significant scale, that there would be an upwards of a 15 to 20% increase in BMP per capita, vis-a-vis the counterfactual that all things being equal, we don't introduce the technology. But the collective effects of all these forces, some working for infill, less travel, some working for decentralization, more travel, I think it's understood on net it's probably going to be positive. How much, though, there hasn't been any good modeling studies I'm aware of. Now, I'm going to talk about TOD, and I suspect, you know, from your survey, a lot of folks know what that is: compact, mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly development, focused on major public transport corridors and stations, be it rail or even bus rapid transit, say. But the way I sort of choose to think about TOD as a conceptual basis for advancing sustainable urban growth is its pedestrian oriented. That is, the notion of TOD long has been this idea of great walkable communities where within a 5-minute headshed, so to speak, of a station or a major bus stop or depot, you have a lot of activities can be reached within 5 minutes. So this idea of mixed use, walkable development huddled around transit, and then interconnecting these PODs, pedestrian oriented nodes, you have great world-class electric trains of some kind, so interconnecting them. So that's the core notion of TOD, is these ped sheds. And the transit metropolis idea is that we, through good planning and design, we interconnect them by world-class great public transit. Well, as it relates to, I'm going to focus most of my comments here about the post-COVID world. The future of TOD very much lies with the future of transit. Successful transit is absolutely essential to TOD, and I think we're all aware transit faces a number of headwinds in light of COVID. And virtually every American system has seen a dramatic decline in ridership from the pre-pandemic level, despite federal subsidies, and even big cities with a long tradition of transit, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and so forth. And I think we're aware why. And by the way, I wanted to emphasize where we've seen this dramatic drop in transit is where you have significant service knowledge-based economies, a lot of college-educated workers. If you go to a place like Dhaka, Bangladesh, or parts of Latin America, South Asia, transit is pretty much back to former levels, if not even higher. But it's these areas where you have the ability to remote work for a significant part of the workforce that we've seen this big decline. Obviously the avoidance of crowded public spaces is hurting transit in light of COVID. The increase in crime, that's partly tied to some of the homeless social problems we face in our cities. But the other reality is we have a lot more mobility options, be it ride-hail services or bike sharing, whatever the case. But collectively, this had really cut significantly in transit ridership, and that's going to unavoidably hurt the potential of TOD. But it's also the fact that most of the decline in ridership has been choice travelers, people with cars, and have the alternative of either not working or driving a car. And that's the dilemma we face, is that public transit and TOD really only create big benefit if you get motorists, people who otherwise would drive, switching to trains and buses. If your ridership is mainly people who are transit dependent and they have no choice, they would take transit regardless, you're not going to clean the environment, reduce tailpipe emissions, reduce congestion, decarbonize your cities. So that's part of the limits of TOD in an environment where we have more of a ridership being transit dependence. But there's also a concern that we're going to stigmatize transit. It's really captive transit dependent users. You're not going to have these mixed income, vibrant communities that a lot of people are naturally drawn to. And my concern is that in light of this, are we going to repeat what we experienced 30, 40 years ago of the structural decline in transit, where decline in ridership leads to cuts in service, which further leads to declines in ridership, which further leads to cuts. It's transit in the midst of this huge downward spiral in these American cities where people have these other choices. And so that's the TO and TOD. So unless transit really recovers, there's no chance that TOD, as a dominant form of sustainable urbanism, is going to really achieve the kinds of expectations people have long held for transit. But it's also the D in TOD, development. And we're all aware that this COVID, particularly, and remote work has led to this accelerated decentralization. This happens to be the Northern California mega region where I live, and 13 million folks, 6 million employees, and it's a huge global innovation hub, the Silicon Valley, San Francisco. But there's been the first year and a half of COVID, a dramatic decentralization of office jobs and a growing preference for a suburban, exurban lifestyle. So this is where most of the office job growth is occurring, whatever growth is happening, and where the strong preferences for housing. And to no surprise, Silicon Valley and San Francisco, it's been the opposite. And again, the graphs to the right kind of show this. And I suspect this is repeated in virtually every mega region in the country, but I think it's particularly pronounced in the San Francisco Bay Area since we are such a knowledge service industry kind of economy. It's been estimated in the Bay Area 30% of the workforce can work remotely 3 to 4 days a week, and I think most of the U.S. the figure is more in the 20 to 25% range. So we're experiencing unavoidably because of these forces, these shift in density profiles. This is the classic density gradient, density on the vertical axis, be it people per square 1,000 square feet of office space, or be it housing residential density. And on the horizontal axis is distance from the CBD. And this is the classic automobile metropolis where you have because auto-oriented development is kind of scattered, spread evenly throughout the metropolis. Historically, it's thought of as kind of a gradual straight decline. And the notion of a transit-oriented metropolis, and this was my 1998 book with a graph from that, but you have these subcenters. You get not only, because these are radially oriented rail networks where you typically have successful transit-oriented development, you obviously have the highest densities in the central business district and then a tapering of distance, but you get these subcenters, these transit-oriented developments. But what we're seeing in the post-COVID metropolis, I believe, is this further flattening of the density gradient, but less peaking as well. In the central business district, we have empty downtown office buildings, and unless we convert this to housing, which some places are doing, we're going to see a de-densification of our CBDs, but also potentially the subcenters, and that's less dense subcenters. And then this exurban micropolitan development. The statistics I last saw suggest that exurban micropolitan growth is 30 to 40% faster right now than urban growth in the last several years. So what this really means in terms of this reshaping of the metropolis, less towards traditional and transit-oriented development. And by the way, I just wanted to point out that historically we think that the agglomeration benefits and proximity benefits of being near a train station or BRT station gets capitalized into land values. This is kind of a graph from one of my books. And that has long formed the basis of the idea of value capture and transit joint development. If you look at the TOD index, this is from John Rennie's work, where he tracks for several hundred station areas, transit station areas across the US, vis-a-vis Zillow's national average of housing prices. You can see TODs since the 90s have certainly outperformed the urban housing markets, but there's been a flattening since 2020 and 2021. And I actually contacted John a month ago. Do you have the latest statistics? He doesn't, but I suspect it's gone down. But if there is less of a value towards densification and agglomeration and proximity to transit, it will get reflected in real estate values. And I think anecdotally, we're beginning to see that. But in terms of this de-densification of subcenters and micropolitan exurban development, I am firmly convinced that the TOD increasingly is going to be this kind of transit village profile. I don't want to sound too much auto-promotional here, but I did co-author a book in 1997 with Mike Burnick called Transit Villages in the 21st Century. And it very much was about, instead of these Le Corbusier towers in the park, 10 to 15 story structures that you might see in Toronto or some big cities, making the argument that kind of the mixed-use village kind of environment within 5-minute ped sheds is better suited for a lot of American settings. And this happens to be the San Jose Cotto Transit Village, which is a modest density transit village off the light rail network. But the key notion here is that these are wood frame 4-story walk-up structures. When you go from a 4-story wood frame construction to a higher density 8 to 10-story steel concrete frame structure, where you have to have these very strong concrete beams and steel structures, you increase the cost of housing some 50% per square foot. So eliminating elevators, reducing crowded spaces, having cheaper, more affordable walk-up structures, with potentially putting in tuck under parking instead of these separate parking garages and car sharing and vehicle sharing, I think is indeed the future in light of these trends. And this happens to be a pretty successful transit village, and all things considered. People want to live here and live, work, shop, play. It's one of these kind of developments that's marketed is a mixed use. Now, the benefit of mixed use, I believe this is a kind of a hidden benefit of this kind of pandemic trend, is that I think we all recognize that the curse of public transit from a cost standpoint has long been the fact that we serve these diurnal peaks, these peaks spread out over from 6 in the morning to 7 at night, a 12 to 13-hour period. And the cost of serving those peaks, the very high marginal costs, because of the spread time shift penalties and split work penalties and overtime and so forth, if you begin to increase more ridership from mixed land uses in the midday and weekends and have less extreme peaking, you potentially reduce the very high marginal cost of public transit provision. And the fact that the biggest ridership losses have been the commuter trips in the peak hour and less of a loss in the middays and weekends, maybe we're going to at least get some cost savings from these kind of development patterns and trends that we're seeing. But anyway, I think this idea of the transit village is part of the future. The green transit village, this happens to be Hammarby Sjöstad, that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with in Stockholm. But this is a zero waste, zero net carbon, totally renewable energy development. And this is a car light development in the sense of very few cars, and land that otherwise would be given over to parking is instead community gardens and tot lots and so forth. But this project, I contacted some friends a few months back from KTH, and they don't really have necessarily firm statistics on it, but it's understood that this is not in the core of Stockholm, but fairly close to the center. It's close to a congestion pricing zone, but it's retained pretty high commercial residential occupancy rates and rent premium. So, I think these kind of village type profiles of transit are the future in light of the trends I've just noted. Now, this is kind of an aspirational vision in the sense that if indeed what we're seeing is this deconcentration of our cities, less of a monocentric urbanization pattern where the dominant share of workforces and office buildings downtown towards these multi-centric, multi-centered kind of metropolis, it really creates an opportunity at a mega regional scale. And I think this is part of the problem. Our long-range planning typically occurs through MPOs, which are in certain ways anachronisms in light of the exurban micropolitan development we're seeing. But if we had the capacity to do these mega regional planning things, in 20 years, maybe we could begin to create these mega regional networks of electric mobility between the subcenters and micro mobility, sustainable shared mobility within the subcenters. And if you do this well, I mean, classically, this would be the benefits of having multi-directional travel flows. I mean, the curse of a predominantly monocentric metropolis is that everything flows through the central business district in the morning, and buses and trains are backhauling half empty in the peak hours. You get much more balanced travel flows with this kind of multi-centered metropolis. But again, electric vehicles and electric fast trains between the centers with hot lanes and proper pricing, and then shared micro mobility and walking and cycling and so forth within the centers. And I think what is helping maybe bring this along, virtually every metropolis I'm aware of now global city has embraced this idea of the 15-minute city. First, I guess it was Mayor Hidalgo from Paris that gets a lot of the credit, but I think we're all familiar with this idea. But this is kind of a public policy reframing that I think can further usher in this kind of vision I just outlined. But it's this very notion where 60 to 70% of everyday activities, gym, meeting a friend over coffee, going to the local grocery store, or is takes place within your transit village or accessible community, and the 30% of trips that you need to say get to work or go to a regional shopping or a sports facility takes place by train. But anyway, that's the accessible city idea is, I think, helping to bring potentially this kind of form of suburban growth. But I think also working in favor is the trend towards micro shared mobility. Again, this is kind of a lifestyle shift. Mobility as a service is a wonderful idea. Maybe it hasn't caught on as quickly as a lot of us were hoping, but you subscribe and mobility becomes a conveyance. And the key idea is that you get right sizing, the right vehicle for the right trip. You don't need a turbocharged 2-ton cage to shuttle around a neighborhood to do light shopping and so forth. But also, it's not just sharing vehicles, sharing seats, things like Uber Pool and so forth. So what this does potentially, in my view, is move us towards, instead of the TOD idea of a 5-minute ped shed, it's a 15-minute shared mobility, kind of micro mobility shed that is brought about through this focus on the accessible city. There are potential cost savings from this. Take a city like Singapore, and I know a lot of folks at MIT have long been involved in Singapore. Singapore was long been one of my models of a transit metropolis, a wonderfully master planned metropolis, and it's certainly got transit-oriented development historically. But if you get at the suburbs of Singapore, they long have relied on these automated driverless electric trains to provide that first mile connectivity. They are now trying to replace that, which much more economical. Instead of separate guideways and the very high cost of elevated automated train structures, you just get autonomous shuttles, electric shuttles, to basically achieve that same first last mile connectivity, allowing this vision of a 15-minute city. In Singapore's case, they define it as a 20-minute town for these 60 to 70% of activities that you occur locally in the community, and a 45-minute city to get to work or to regional shopping or to say some major sports concert event. And of course, in Singapore, they've long done kind of congestion pricing, though it's been this kind of klutzy cordon-based pricing. They're advancing this global navigation satellite system where they can do true dynamic pricing, where you real-time adjust the price based on congestion levels, where and when you drive. Anyway, they're because of technology and this vision, I think they're advancing this sustainable transit metropolis, though on a different scale as originally envisioned. I just want to briefly mention about autonomous or automated vehicles. To me, what could work in favor of this vision as much as anything is the fact that through robotics you can drive these vehicles very precisely. So instead of this classical 11, 12-foot wide lane, we could shrink lanes down to 7 or 8 feet, free up a lot of real estate. That we've had overly crowded sidewalks in a lot of settings in this kind of post-COVID period, but also begin to achieve some kind of true complete street where we have dedicated infrastructure for bikes and electric bikes and walking and all forms of micromobility. And I put this image on the very bottom right side. We have a notion in the US of streetscapes of dichotomizing it. Either it's a motorized lane or it's a non-motorized lane. Well, we're getting so much variation in speeds and exposure levels of weight to speed ratios that this idea of tertiary, even some kind of more refined dedication of space for electric bikes or regular pedal bike or pedestrians versus moving cars. So, we have all these kind of possibilities, again, in light of this 15-minute accessible city notion. I just wanted to kind of close briefly on parking. If we are to get this marriage of shared mobility and autonomous mobility, which would mean pretty much these robo-taxis, I think we all recognize that would dramatically reduce the demand for parking. And, we could plausibly convert parking structures to things like housing units. The key word here is obviously future proofing. We don't want to be building parking structures now, which make this conversion difficult in the next 15 to 20 years, including in the transit village environment. So what that means is instead of sloping floor structures, you have ramps, spiral ramps on the exterior. Instead of rectangular or square designs where the interior are dark, you have rectangular designs where light can get into the interior. You can plausibly have housing. Instead of 8 to 9 foot ceilings, you have 12-foot ceilings where you can put in ventilation ducts and heating systems. So this kind of conversion possibility, future-proofing our design, could help bring about these changes. But what's critically important here is that we put in place now the kinds of design building codes that allow this future-proofing of our design. So on parking, I'm going to kind of close here with this notion that I talked about the Pleasant, I talked about transit villages, and the example I'm using here from this book is Pleasant Hill. The cover of this book is actually the Pleasant Hill BART station. This again was 1997. And this was perhaps one of the first uses, for me at least, of Photoshop. But this is a pretty klutzy by today's standards effort. This was a surface parking structure, and we sort of photoshopped in this kind of civic space. But this is actually the parking lot that has now been infilled. And BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, has long been trying to convert surface parking to housing, and they've indeed done it, and replacing it with some much more expensive structured parking. And it's been triggered somewhat by this kind of shared mobility and lifestyle shift, people, the demand for affordable housing. But what we're seeing actually now is because of the dramatic declines in ridership, a lot of surface parking lots are virtually empty. This is actually a graph I got from the newspaper a couple of weeks ago here in the San Francisco Chronicle, but it shows that rail transit in the tech-heavy San Francisco Bay Area has been harder hit by COVID's after effects than any rail network. I mean, these are all systems where the radial network's funneling workers to downtown, but you can see BART is only 28% of its pre-COVID ridership. I see the Boston MBTA is 49%. It suffered losses, but not to the degree of what we've experienced here. And again, because we have such a tech-heavy, knowledge-based workforce that's working at home remotely, it's really cut dramatically in the ridership. But it's not just in the US. You can also go to London. This was from The Guardian I read a couple of weeks ago, that the mayor of London saying we could be mired in gridlock. The tube is only about 1/2 of its pre-COVID ridership level. So it's pretty much all global cities with a knowledge-based workforce and economy that's suffering these effects. But what this does mean is we have the possibility of converting surface parking to more housing. And what I'm showing here on this graph is sleeping stations. The Pleasant Hill BART station that again, was highlighted in this book on transit villages. It's been an 80% decline in ridership, despite the fact that we put all this housing at the transit stations, simply because many people living here are not going to work anymore to office developments. They're working out of their apartments or at a coffee house nearby. But the reality is that this project is very successful still. It's like a 98% occupancy. It's pretty much occupied. It still has a very high rent premium, and it's the fact that people still want these mixed-use walkable developments that this was planned as part of a master plan transit village. So, I think there's a lot of potential for transit villages in the sense that we have all these empty surface parking lots off the rail networks, and a lot of them have good access to freeways that represent pre-assembled large swaths of real estate that you can infill and put housing projects in. Now, the reality is proximity to transit perhaps is more a secondary factor. It's not the fact that it's focused on transit that's the big selling point. It's the fact that you can probably build housing easier on these underutilized surface parking lots than pretty much any place in the suburbs and the exurbs, and still create the opportunity to occasionally use transit, maybe not on a regular basis, but even if you go to the office 1 or 2 days a week, you have that option. So anyway, I think we're going to see transit-oriented transit village development, but the proximity to transit perhaps is going to be more of a secondary importance than anything. Now, I did a lot of research on people's desire to live near transit stops, and this is an article from 2007. It's about TOD's ridership bonus being a product of self-selection. And I actually used data from this Pleasant Hill BART station I just showed, where surveys in 2003, for instance, showed 45% of the people living within a half a mile of the Pleasant Hill BART station were taking BART to work, the rail system. Within the donut, 1/2 to 3 miles away, it was only 14%. And within the larger city of Pleasant Hill, beyond 3 miles, it was only 8%. So clearly, there was sorting going on. People were buying into housing and renting housing near the transit stops for the very reason they wanted good access to workplace. Well, clearly, I don't think that's the future. I think self-selection is probably going to dramatically decline as a motivator to live near transit. It's going to be the fact that more people are drawn still to, in suburban, exurban settings, good quality master plan, mixed use, walkable communities. And transit itself will become of secondary importance. My very last slide, I take a little time. It's, everything I've talked about here is mainly from a US perspective, but it's essential that when we think about the future of our cities and things like TOD, that we not lose sight of the fact that the truth is, on a global scale, we have to think globally increasingly if we're concerned about things like carbon and the future of our planet. 80 to 90% of our urban population growth is going to be in the global south. It's not going to be in the US and Europe. And the challenges are fundamentally different. This happens to be Ho Chi Minh City. And I kind of bring it up in the sense that this is a project from the World Bank that I worked on with Peter Calthorpe Associates, based in Berkeley. And as some of you might know, Peter Calthorpe is credited with having coined the term TOD. He wrote a famous book in 1993 on this. And so Peter and I were jointly brought in to help promote TOD around a bus rapid transit system in Ho Chi Minh City, as well as the planned rail network. And we said, of course, we'll try to do it. But the reality is over 90% of the trips are in mopeds and motorcycles. And you can see the reality is it's a coastal city that floods a lot because of rising sea levels. The challenges are so fundamentally different in a context like this than everything I've just outlined. And even though we sort of came up with some TOD design ideas for the DRT network, what we really argued for was there's a plan for a master plan new town, over 1 million people upland north of the city where you have currently a greenfield, but really coming up with this idea of a dedicated one-way network of electric bikes where you would have great separation between motorized vehicles on this grid, and then separation for safety reasons in part of electric scooters and mopeds. And hopefully these would be from renewable energy sources, maybe, if electricity is coming from coal-fired power plants, it's not going to do a lot to decarbonize the cities. But if we can really advance sustainable electricity production, and but the reality is most of the population are Gen Zs, people born since 1997. They've been reared on mopeds and motorcycles, and they're simply not going to shift to public transit. So let's design for sustainable private, maybe some shared mobility with motorcycle taxis, but nonetheless, really downplaying TOD in this very context for the very reasons I outlined. So again, right. It's not a manila envelope solution. There's different strategies for different places. And I will close with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Robert Cervero.